title thief!
I just wanted to clean your windshield, sir, for $1. That's all. Just $1.
Don't touch my property. You people always work in pairs. One distracts, one robs. I know exactly how this works.
I don't have anyone with me.
A small crowd gathered the way crowds always do outside dealerships, half real shoppers wandering the lot, half people drawn toward the sound of a raised voice the way moths are drawn toward anything bright enough to burn them. A woman near the showroom doors lowered her phone from texting, thumb hovering over the record button, already imagining, somewhere in the back of her mind, how many times this might get shared. The boy lowered his head. He didn't argue. He'd learned long ago that arguing only made the cruelty feel justified to the person dishing it out, gave them a reason instead of leaving them with only an excuse. He tucked the rag back into the loop of his shorts and turned to walk away across the cold, wet asphalt, the way he had walked away from 100 small cruelties just like this one. He didn't see the man standing frozen in the showroom doorway behind him. Walter Briggs wasn't looking at the boy's face. He was looking at his wrist, at a worn strip of leather cord, and a heavy gold watch tied to it. Tarnished and scratched, but unmistakably, impossibly familiar. The way a voice on the phone can be impossibly familiar before you've even placed whose it is. His coffee cup slipped out of his hand and shattered on the showroom tile behind him. He didn't notice. He was already moving. "Wait," he said, his voice breaking as he pushed through the glass doors into the rain-damp air. "Wait, please." The boy turned, flinching, already bracing for one more voice raised against him. Instead, he found a heavy-set, grey-haired man in a polo shirt, with the dealership's logo stitched over his heart, staring at his arm like he had seen something rise up out of the ground. "Where?" Walter whispered. "Did you get that watch?" Walter Briggs had owned the dealership for 14 years. Before that, he'd worked the floor himself for 9. Selling sedans to families who couldn't quite afford them and SUVs to men trying to prove something to themselves. He was good at the job in the way that quiet, observant people are often good at sales, not because he was charming, but because he listened. He noticed things other people didn't. That morning he'd been standing near the coffee station just inside the glass doors, half listening to his sales manager complain about quarterly numbers, when the raised voice from the lot pulled his attention outside. He almost looked away. He'd seen this particular ugliness before entitled customers, kids hustling for change, the predictable collision between the two. It wasn't his business to intervene in every small cruelty that happened on his property. He'd learned that lesson the hard way, once, years ago, with a customer who'd complained to corporate and nearly cost him his franchise. But the boy's wrist had stopped him cold, and now he was kneeling on wet asphalt in front of a child he'd known for less than a minute. His own heart beat loud in his ears. Tobias's instinct was to cover the watch, the way he covered anything that might be taken from him. His hand moved protectively over his wrist before he could stop it. "It's mine," he said quickly. "It was my grandfather's. He gave it to me before he died. He told me I should never sell it, no matter how hungry I got. I never have. Not even when let me see it," Walter said. "Please, I'm not going to take it. I promise you that. I just need to see it." There was something in the older man's voice that made Tobias pause, not the practiced gentleness adults sometimes used right before they tried to manipulate him, but something raw, something that sounded almost like fear. He held out his wrist. Walter knelt on the wet pavement, not caring about his slacks, and turned the watch face up with hands that had started to shake. He ran his thumb along the worn gold casing over scratches that had clearly been there for decades. Scratches he recognized the way you recognize the geography of your own childhood home. He turned it over. Engraved on the back, nearly smoothed away by years of handling but still legible if you knew exactly what you were looking for, were 3 letters. RJB Walter made a sound that wasn't quite a word. His knees seemed to give slightly, and for a moment Tobias thought the man might actually fall. "This was my father's watch," Walter whispered. "I gave it to my brother. The day he left home, 22 years ago." Tobias went very still. "My grandfather's name was Robert," he said slowly, like he was testing the words before fully trusting them. "Robert James. He never told me his last name. He used to say it didn't matter anymore, that the name belonged to someone he used to be." Walter looked up at him, and something in his expression had cracked open entirely. "Robert James Briggs," he said. "He was my older brother." The crowd that had gathered to watch a child be humiliated now stood frozen, watching something they didn't have words for. The man in the silver suit, the one whose voice had started all of it, stood several feet away with his sunglasses still pushed up into his hair, his mouth slightly open. His earlier outrage replaced by something close to embarrassment he didn't yet know how to perform his way out of. The woman with the phone kept filming. She would later say she didn't even remember deciding to keep recording her hand, had simply stayed where it was, as if some part of her understood this had stopped being someone else's humiliation and become something else entirely, something that mattered. "Where is he?" Walter asked, his hand still gripping the boy's wrist gently, like he was afraid that if he let go, the watch and the boy might disappear the way his brother had 2 decades earlier. "Is your grandfather?" "He died," Tobias said quietly. 3 months ago. "Heart problems," the doctor said. "He'd been sick a long time, but we didn't have money for he stopped himself. The way kids stop themselves when they've learned that certain sentences make adults uncomfortable. We didn't have insurance. He didn't want to go to the hospital because of the bills. So we took care of him at home. Until we couldn't anymore." Walter closed his eyes. When he opened them again, they were wet. "I looked for him for years," he said. "I hired 2 different investigators. The first one gave up after 8 months. The second one told me there was nothing left to find, that sometimes people who leave don't want to be found, and chasing them only hurts the people doing the chasing." I believed him. God help me, I believed him. And I stopped looking 11 years ago. "He used to talk about you," Tobias said suddenly, surprising himself with how easily the words came. "Not by name, he never said your name. But he used to say he had a little brother once, and that he hoped his brother had a good life, because he never got the chance to make sure of it himself." Walter's breath caught audibly. "He said he made mistakes," Tobias continued. "Quieter now. Big ones. He never told me what they were. He said some doors, once you close them, you convince yourself you don't have the right to open them again. Even when you want to. Especially when you want to." For a long moment, Walter Briggs, 51 years old, owner of the 3rd largest dealership in the county, a man who had built an entire adult life around the absence of his brother, without ever quite admitting that's what he was doing, said nothing at all. He simply knelt there on the wet pavement, holding the wrist of a boy he had met 4 minutes earlier, who was somehow, impossibly, family. It was Tobias who finally broke the silence, because there was something more urgent pressing at him than the shock of the moment. "My mom," he said. "She's sick too. Not the same as Grandpa, but she has trouble breathing sometimes, and we don't have money for her medicine right now, and that's part of why I'm out here. And where is she?" Walter said immediately, standing, pulling Tobias up with him in the same motion. "Right now. Where is your mother right now?" "The shelter on 9th Street. She's there because we lost the apartment after Grandpa's funeral. We couldn't make rent and pay for the burial both. Walter was already turning toward the showroom, already calling out to his sales manager standing frozen in the doorway. Get my car. The Suburban, not the loaner. Now, Walter. What I'll explain later. Get the car. He turned back to Tobias, kneeling again so they were eye level, his big hands resting on the boy's thin shoulders. I am not going to pretend I understand everything that's happening right now, he said, his voice steadier than it had been a moment ago, like some old instinct for taking care of people had kicked back in beneath the shock. But I know this. You are my brother's grandson. That makes you my family. And I have spent 22 years with an empty chair at every holiday table, wondering where he was, wondering if he was even alive. I am not going to waste one more day wondering about anything that's in front of me right now. The man in the silver suit, still standing near his car, cleared his throat awkwardly. Look, I didn't realize the kid was Walter didn't even turn his head. You called a 10-year-old a thief for offering to clean your windshield, he said, his voice flat and final. I'd think very carefully about what you say next, because right now, the only thing keeping me from telling you exactly what I think of you is that I don't have the time to waste on it. The man's mouth closed. Walter turned back to Tobias. Let's go get your mother. The drive to the shelter on 9th Street took 11 minutes, though Tobias would later remember it as feeling much longer, the kind of stretched, unreal time that comes with shock, where the world outside the car window seems to move at a different speed than the thoughts inside your head. Walter didn't feel the silence with small talk. He asked questions, careful and unhurried, about Tobias's mother, about how long they'd been at the shelter, about whether Tobias had been in school. He listened the way he always had, the skill that had made him good at sales translating, in this entirely different context, into something closer to grace. It was the third question that made Tobias go quiet. Does your mother know about the watch? Did your grandfather ever tell her who he really was, who he used to be, before he was Robert James? Tobias hesitated. She knows, he said finally. She's known the whole time. She told me never to tell anyone the last name, not even when things got really bad. She said if certain people ever found out we existed, it would only bring trouble, not help. Walter's hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel. What people? I don't know exactly. She never explained it all the way. But she said your family, your side of it, had money, and money like that doesn't share well. She said Grandpa left because of something that happened with land, or a will, or something like that. She said if anyone with the Briggs name ever found us, they'd assume we wanted something from them, and they'd never believe we didn't. Walter's jaw tightened, the easy warmth of the last 20 minutes giving way to something more complicated old family history rising back up through the floorboards of a conversation that had, until that moment, felt almost like a miracle without edges. There was a dispute, he admitted slowly, after our father died, about the dealership and some property out near the county line. Robert thought he'd been cut out unfairly. He probably had a right to feel that way. I won't pretend our father was a fair man exactly, but Robert left before we could ever really talk it through. He didn't take a single thing with him. Not money. Not even his name, apparently. My mum said you have a son, Tobias said quietly, almost like he was testing whether this part of the story was even safe to say out loud. She said your son might not like finding out there's another branch of the family, especially one that might have a claim to things. Walter exhaled slowly, the Suburban idling now at a red light 2 blocks from 9th Street. I do have a son, he said, and I won't lie to you and pretend that conversation will be simple. But Tobias, that's not your problem to solve. That's not a 10-year-old's problem to carry. You hear me? Tobias didn't answer right away. Because the truth he hadn't said yet, the thing his mother had told him only once, in a hushed voice, the week after the funeral, when she thought he was asleep, was a truth far heavier than an old land dispute, and far more complicated than a missing watch with engraved initials. It was the truth about why his grandfather had really left 22 years ago. Not a fight over property. Not a disagreement about inheritance. Something Robert James Briggs had done, something that, if it ever came to light, would change not just how Walter saw his long-lost brother, but how he saw the family name he'd spent his whole life protecting. The light turned green. The Suburban moved forward. And somewhere 2 blocks away, in a small shelter room with a single window facing the parking lot, a woman who had spent 6 weeks teaching her son to survive on a stranger's spare change was about to see, through that window, the one car in the entire city she had hoped and feared she would never see again.